Meet Olivia Harris, the school district's powerful and dedicated superintendent. But today, a simple visit to one of her schools is about to take a dark turn. She's mistaken for just another teacher by a security officer with dangerous assumptions. His words are cold, his attitude racially charged. Little does he know, the woman he's about to humiliate holds more power than he could imagine. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Let's dive in. The bell rang, echoing through the polished hallways of Lakeside Middle School as students streamed into their classrooms, voices humming with the excitement of a new school year. Lockers slammed shut, sneakers squeaked on the floors, and the fresh scent of paper and pencils filled the air. It was the first day back, and everyone was adjusting to the rhythm of routine once again. In room 207, Olivia Harris stood by her desk, a soft smile on her face as she welcomed each student who walked through the door. Her classroom was warm and inviting, decorated with bright posters of famous historical figures and thought-provoking quotes. On the board behind her, the words "History is written by those who show up" were written in neat, bold letters. Olivia had been at Lakeside for years, first as a history teacher, then as the school's vice principal, and now, though few knew it, as the district superintendent. She had worked her way up through the education system with dedication and passion, driven by her belief in the transformative power of learning. Her leave from Lakeside had been long, a necessary step to focus on broader district initiatives, but she had always felt a deep connection to this school and its students. Today was her first day back in the classroom, and she was ready to make a difference once again, though now with a different perspective. As the students filed in, Olivia could sense the mix of excitement and nervousness in the air. Some recognized her from previous years, while others were new to her. She caught snippets of conversation, whispers about summer vacations, excitement over seeing friends again, and the usual anxieties about starting a new grade. It felt like a typical first day, but there was an underlying energy Olivia couldn't quite place. She watched as the last student, a shy girl with glasses, slipped into the room and found her seat at the back of the class. Olivia took a deep breath, standing tall in front of her desk. It felt good to be back in front of students again. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice calm but authoritative. "Welcome to history class. My name is Mrs. Harris, and I'm excited to be here with all of you this year. We're going to learn a lot, but most importantly, we're going to think critically about the world around us." The students quieted down, their attention now focused on her. Olivia could see a few of them exchanging glances, likely wondering who this new teacher was and why she seemed so confident. What they didn't know, and what Olivia wasn't about to reveal just yet, was that she wasn't just a teacher. She was the superintendent of the entire school district. A fact that would likely surprise many, especially considering she was a black woman in a role so often dominated by white men. But for now, Olivia was content to play her part as their teacher. She wasn't interested in flaunting her title or authority. Instead, she wanted to earn her students' trust and respect the way she always had, through her work, her teaching, and her commitment to them. As Olivia began outlining the year's curriculum, the door to her classroom opened. She turned her head, expecting a late student or perhaps a fellow teacher stopping by to chat. Instead, a tall figure filled the doorway. Officer Brad Evans, the school's newly assigned security officer. Olivia felt a shift in the room's energy. The students grew quieter, sensing the tension. Officer Evans, a towering man with a military-style haircut, had been at Lakeside for only a few months, having transferred from a neighboring district. His job was to maintain security and discipline within the school, a role he took very seriously, sometimes too seriously, according to the rumors that had already started circulating among staff and students. His presence was commanding, his uniform crisp and intimidating. But what struck Olivia most was the look in his eyes, sharp, assessing, and, to her discomfort, filled with something she couldn't quite name but recognized all too well. It wasn't just the usual authority of a security officer doing his rounds. There was something more there, something personal. "Miss Harris?" Brad said, his tone neither friendly nor hostile, but carrying an edge that made Olivia instinctively stand a little straighter. "Yes?" Olivia replied, keeping her voice steady. "We need to have a word," he said, glancing briefly at the students who were now completely silent, their eyes darting between the two adults. Olivia hesitated for a moment. This wasn't the first time she had been interrupted in her career, but there was something about the way Officer Evans was looking at her that made her uneasy. Still, she wasn't about to show that in front of her students. "I'm in the middle of a lesson," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Can this wait?" Brad's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture stiffening. "It's important," he insisted, stepping further into the classroom, his presence looming over the students. Now, the tension in the room thickened. Olivia could feel her students watching her, waiting to see how she would respond. She glanced at the clock, then back at Officer Evans. Whoever this man was, and whatever his issue was with her, she wasn't about to escalate the situation in front of her students. "All right," she said after a moment, her voice steady. She turned to the class. "Please read the first 2 pages of the chapter while I step out for a moment." The students nodded, their eyes wide with curiosity. Olivia walked toward the door, her posture straight, her head held high. She wasn't about to be intimidated in her own classroom. Once they were in the hallway, the door closing softly behind them, Olivia turned to face Officer Evans, her eyes searching his face for some explanation. She had dealt with difficult situations before, but something about this one felt different. "What's this about, Officer Evans?" she asked, her tone firm but professional. Brad crossed his arms over his broad chest, his gaze steady and unreadable. "We've had some complaints," he said, his voice low but with an unmistakable undercurrent of authority. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Complaints? About me?" Brad nodded. "About your conduct in the classroom. Seems like some of the parents aren't too happy with the way you've been handling certain subjects." Olivia frowned, her mind racing. She had only been back for a day. What could possibly have caused such a reaction so soon? "Specifics, Officer Evans," she said, her tone now edged with frustration. "What exactly are these complaints about?" Brad didn't answer right away. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, his eyes studying her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and condescending. "Let's just say some people don't appreciate certain topics being pushed in the classroom." Olivia's stomach twisted. She had heard this line before, many times in fact, usually when someone took issue with her teaching history. Real history, not the watered-down version some people preferred. She met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I teach the curriculum, Officer Evans. If there's an issue, I suggest you take it up with the administration." Brad's expression didn't change, but Olivia could sense the tension building between them. There was something more to this than just a complaint about curriculum. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, in the way he spoke to her, like she didn't belong here. And she realized, in that moment, that this was going to be a long, difficult year. Olivia stood in the hallway, her mind racing as she faced Officer Brad Evans. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, the unspoken assumptions and prejudice lurking just beneath the surface of their interaction. It wasn't the first time she had encountered someone who thought she didn't belong in a position of authority, but this time felt different. This time, it was happening in the place she considered her sanctuary. Her school. The students were inside the classroom, oblivious to the deeper conflict playing out just outside the door. Olivia could sense their curiosity, their eyes probably glued to the door, wondering what was happening between their new teacher and the intimidating officer who had interrupted their lesson. She needed to handle this delicately, but she also knew she couldn't let Brad continue to challenge her in this way. "Officer Evans," Olivia said, her voice calm but firm, "I appreciate your concern, but if there are any issues with my teaching, I suggest you take them up with the administration. I'm sure they'd be happy to review the curriculum with you." Brad's eyes narrowed slightly, his arms still crossed over his chest. He clearly wasn't used to being spoken to this way. "It's not about the curriculum, Miss Harris. It's about your approach. Parents are concerned that you're pushing certain agendas, and I'm here to ensure this school remains a neutral place." Olivia felt a spark of anger flare up inside her, but she kept her emotions in check. "My approach is to teach history as it happened, without sugarcoating the truth. If there are concerns about that, They should be addressed through the proper channels. Brad's tone shifted slightly, a condescending edge creeping into his voice. Look, I don't want to make a big deal out of this. I'm just trying to do my job. Maybe we could avoid some unnecessary complications if you stick to what's appropriate. Appropriate? Olivia repeated, her voice now sharp. She knew exactly what he meant, though he hadn't said it outright. She had been teaching about civil rights, about the struggles and triumphs of people of color throughout history. And it was clear that some people like Officer Evans, were uncomfortable with that. Brad didn't answer, but the smug look on his face said enough. He was testing her, pushing boundaries, trying to assert his power over her. Olivia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her anger simmering just below the surface. She had worked too hard and come too far to let someone like Brad Evans undermine her. "I'll make something clear to you, Officer Evans," Olivia said, her voice low and controlled. "I am here to educate these students. My classroom is a place where they will learn the truth about our world, about history, and about the struggles that have shaped it. If anyone has a problem with that, they're welcome to speak to the school board." She watched as Brad's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her, a black woman who wasn't afraid to stand her ground. "This isn't over, Miss Harris," he said quietly, his voice now edged with a threat. "You'll see." With that, Brad turned and walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the walls. Olivia stood there for a moment, watching him go, her mind buzzing with the implications of their exchange. She knew this wasn't the last time she'd have to deal with him. Something about the way he had spoken to her, the way he had looked at her, made it clear that he wasn't going to let this go. But Olivia wasn't one to back down. She had faced challenges her whole life, and she had always found a way to rise above them. This was just another obstacle, one she would have to navigate carefully, but with the same resolve that had brought her to this position of leadership. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked back into the classroom. The students were waiting, their eyes wide with curiosity. Olivia smiled at them, determined not to let the tension from her conversation with Officer Evans seep into the classroom. "All right," she said, her voice bright and confident. "Where were we?" "Ah, yes, the March on Washington. Does anyone know why this moment in history was so significant?" A few hands went up hesitantly, and Olivia smiled as she called on a student in the front row. As the discussion resumed, she found herself relaxing slightly. This was where she belonged, with her students, helping them understand the world in all its complexity. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the encounter with Officer Evans. She knew he wasn't going to let this go, and she had a feeling things were about to get much more difficult. As the day progressed, Olivia tried to focus on her lessons, but she couldn't help but notice the way some of her colleagues looked at her as she walked through the hallways. There were whispers, exchanged glances, subtle signs that word of her confrontation with Brad was spreading. Lakeside had always been a place where everyone knew each other's business, and it didn't take long for rumors to start circulating. By the time the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Olivia was exhausted. She packed up her things slowly, taking a moment to collect her thoughts before heading home. As she left the building, she spotted Brad across the parking lot, leaning against his patrol car. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, neither of them looked away. Olivia could feel the tension between them thickening. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was going to be a battle. And she wasn't sure just how far Officer Evans was willing to go. That night, as Olivia sat at her kitchen table, her thoughts still tangled around the events of the day, she knew one thing for certain. The next few weeks were going to be critical. She couldn't afford to make any missteps, not with the scrutiny that was sure to follow. Her phone buzzed with a notification, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw an email from the district's administrative office. A meeting had been scheduled, with her and Officer Evans, to address the complaints that had been filed against her. Olivia's chest tightened, but she took a deep breath and steadied herself. She wasn't going to let this intimidate her. She had fought too hard for her place in this school, in this district. She wasn't about to back down now. Whatever came next, she would be ready. Olivia sat behind her desk early the next morning, staring at her computer screen, though her mind wasn't focused on the lesson plan in front of her. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the email she had received the night before. The one that confirmed a meeting had been scheduled with Officer Evans and the district's administrative office. She knew it was coming, but that didn't make it any less unsettling. The complaints Brad had mentioned still gnawed at her. Complaints about her teaching? From whom? It made no sense. She had only been back for a day, and her lessons were nothing out of the ordinary, except, of course, for the topic of civil rights. But even that shouldn't have caused an uproar. Not in a school that prided itself on diversity and inclusion. Yet, Olivia knew that sometimes just the simple act of telling the truth could be controversial in certain circles. The students began filtering into the room, pulling Olivia from her thoughts. She straightened up in her chair, forcing a smile as they settled into their seats. Today's lesson was on the Reconstruction era, a period of history that was often glossed over, but held critical lessons about the resilience and struggles of African Americans after the Civil War. Olivia was passionate about teaching this chapter in history because it mirrored many of the social struggles people faced even today. As the class began, Olivia moved through the lesson with her usual enthusiasm, but she couldn't help noticing the tension in the room. The students were quieter than usual, their eyes frequently flickering toward the door, as if they were expecting another interruption. She could sense their unease, and it was only a matter of time before one of them spoke up. "Mrs. Harris?" A voice piped up from the back of the room. Olivia looked up to see a boy named Marcus, one of the more outspoken students in her class, raising his hand. "Yes, Marcus? What happened yesterday? Why was Officer Evans here?" The question hung in the air, and Olivia could feel the other students leaning in, eager for an explanation. She paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. She didn't want to say too much, but she also didn't want to dismiss their curiosity. After all, they had seen a glimpse of something they probably didn't understand, and she believed in being transparent with her students, at least as much as she could be. "Officer Evans was concerned about something happening in the school," Olivia said slowly, her voice measured. "We had a conversation to address those concerns. But don't worry, it's nothing you need to be worried about." Marcus wasn't satisfied, but it felt weird. He seemed mad at you. Olivia smiled gently. "I appreciate your concern, Marcus, but you don't need to worry about me. Sometimes people have disagreements, but it's important to stay respectful and work through them, right?" There were nods around the room, though Olivia could see that some of the students still had questions. But before anyone could press further, the door to the classroom opened again, and this time it was the principal, Mr. Drew Thompson, who stepped inside. "Mrs. Harris, may I have a word?" he asked, his expression unreadable. Olivia felt her stomach tighten. Another interruption, another conversation outside the classroom. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing, something that went beyond just complaints about her teaching. "Of course," Olivia replied, glancing at the students. "Please continue reading the next section in your textbooks. I'll be right back." As she stepped into the hallway with Mr. Thompson, she could feel the weight of his presence beside her. He was a tall man, always impeccably dressed, with an air of professionalism that bordered on rigidity. He had been principal at Lakeside for over a decade, and though Olivia had always respected him, she couldn't deny that he sometimes seemed more concerned with appearances than with the substance of what happened inside the classrooms. "What's this about?" Olivia asked, folding her arms as they stopped in the middle of the hallway. Mr. Thompson glanced down the corridor, as if making sure no one was within earshot, before speaking. "There's been some concern raised by Officer Evans about your teaching." Olivia's heart sank. It was happening again. She had hoped the issue would quietly disappear, but now it was clear that it had escalated beyond what she had anticipated. "I've received complaints, Olivia," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice low. "Apparently, some parents aren't happy with the way you're teaching certain subjects." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Certain subjects? I'm teaching history, Mr. Thompson, the same history that's in the curriculum." He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I know, but it's not just about the curriculum, it's about how the material is being presented. Some parents feel that you're, pushing a certain narrative. They're concerned that you're introducing topics that might be too sensitive. Olivia felt a surge of frustration. Sensitive? History is sensitive, Mr. Thompson. We can't sugarcoat the past just because it makes some people uncomfortable. Mr. Thompson held up his hands, trying to placate her. I understand where you're coming from, Olivia. I really do. But you have to understand that this is a delicate situation. The school board has been getting calls, parents are upset, and Officer Evans seems to think that your teaching is causing unrest among the students. Olivia's eyes flashed with indignation. Unrest? I've been back for 1 day. How could my teaching be causing unrest? Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably. Look, I don't think this is about you personally, but we have to be careful. You know how things can escalate. The community is watching, and we don't want to cause unnecessary friction. Olivia stared at him, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. This wasn't about her teaching. It was about something deeper, something that had been simmering under the surface for a long time. She had seen it before, in other schools, in other communities. The discomfort that arose whenever someone dared to challenge the status quo, whenever the truth was told in a way that made people confront their own biases and prejudices. But what stunned the most was the realization that even Mr. Thompson, a man she had worked with for years, wasn't willing to fully stand up for her. He was more concerned with keeping the peace than with standing by what was right. So what do you suggest I do? Olivia asked, her voice tight. Mr. Thompson sighed again. For now, I think it would be best if you tone things down a little. Stick to the basics. Don't introduce anything too controversial until this blows over. Just focus on getting through the next few weeks. Olivia's jaw clenched. She wanted to argue, to push back, to tell him that she wasn't going to water down the truth just to make people feel comfortable. But she knew that wasn't going to get her anywhere right now. The system wasn't built to accommodate people like her. People who wanted to change things from within. She had to be smart about this. I'll think about it, Olivia said finally, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. Mr. Thompson nodded, relief washing over his face. Thank you, Olivia. I know this isn't easy, but I appreciate your understanding. He turned and walked away, leaving Olivia standing in the hallway, her thoughts swirling. She had a decision to make. She could either play it safe and do what Mr. Thompson had suggested, or she could continue teaching the way she always had, truthfully, honestly, and with conviction. As she re-entered the classroom, she glanced at her students, who were quietly reading their textbooks. They trusted her to guide them, to teach them about the world, about their history, about the things that truly mattered, and Olivia wasn't sure she could let them down. The storm was building, and Olivia knew that the choices she made in the coming days would determine whether she weathered it or was swept away. But one thing was clear: she wasn't going down without a fight. The atmosphere in Lakeside Middle School grew thick with tension as the days passed. Olivia could feel it in the hallways, the way the other teachers gave her subtle glances, some of them filled with sympathy, others with apprehension. The students had noticed too. Rumors of her confrontation with Officer Evans spread quickly, and it wasn't long before everyone in the school seemed to be talking about it. Despite everything, Olivia continued teaching her lessons as she always had. She refused to water down the truth, even as the pressure from above mounted. She knew that her students needed to learn real history, the full, unvarnished story of their world, with all of its complexities and challenges. She couldn't, in good conscience, betray that responsibility. But the complaints didn't stop. In fact, they only seemed to grow louder. Mr. Thompson, the principal, had pulled Olivia aside more than once to caution her about the growing unrest. He wanted her to keep the peace, to avoid controversial topics, but Olivia couldn't bring herself to do it. Each time she stood before her students, she was reminded of why she had become an educator in the first place. Then, one afternoon, everything came to a head. It was just after lunch when Olivia was walking through the school's main corridor, heading toward the teacher's lounge for a brief break. The hallways were unusually quiet, with most of the students and teachers still in their classrooms. As she rounded the corner, she saw a small group of teachers gathered near the entrance to the school. In the center of the group stood Officer Evans, his back turned to her. He was speaking in low tones, but his voice carried enough for Olivia to catch snippets of the conversation. "I'm just saying, we can't have people coming in here and stirring things up," Brad was saying. His tone was casual, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "This is a school. It's supposed to be a neutral place, not a platform for pushing certain narratives." One of the teachers, a younger woman named Mrs. Benson, nodded slowly. "I understand, officer, but Mrs. Harris? She's just teaching history, isn't she?" Brad turned slightly, his eyes narrowing. "It's not about what she's teaching, it's about how she's teaching it. I've seen it before. People like her come in with their own agendas, and suddenly the students are questioning everything, causing trouble. We don't need that here." Olivia's chest tightened. She had heard enough. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. "Is there something you'd like to say to me, Officer Evans?" Olivia's voice cut through the air, her tone firm and controlled. The group of teachers immediately fell silent, their eyes widening in surprise. Brad turned around slowly, his expression shifting as he realized Olivia had overheard him. For a brief moment, the two of them locked eyes, the tension between them palpable. "Mrs. Harris," Brad said, his voice smooth but laced with condescension, "I was just having a conversation with some of your colleagues. You know, talking about the importance of keeping things balanced." Olivia raised an eyebrow, her arms crossing over her chest. "Balanced? Is that what you call undermining my authority in front of my peers?" Brad's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now let's not get dramatic. I'm just doing my job, making sure this school stays on track." Olivia took a step closer, her gaze never leaving his. "Your job is to ensure the safety of the students and staff, Officer Evans. It is not your job to police what I teach in my classroom. That's the role of the administration. And last I checked, I've been following the district's curriculum to the letter." One of the teachers shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught in the middle of a situation they hadn't anticipated. The others remained silent, watching the confrontation unfold with wide eyes. Brad's expression hardened. "I'm just trying to keep things from getting out of hand. We don't need anyone stirring up trouble, especially with sensitive subjects like the ones you've been pushing." Olivia's jaw clenched. She had been patient long enough. "Sensitive subjects? You mean history? You mean the truth? Because that's what I've been teaching, Officer Evans. If the truth makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should take a long, hard look at why that is." For a moment, Brad didn't say anything. His face was a mask of cold indifference, but Olivia could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. She had struck a nerve, and they both knew it. "You've got quite the attitude, Mrs. Harris," Brad said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think you understand how things work around here. This is my school, my rules." Olivia's eyes flashed with defiance. "Your school? I don't think so. I've been here for years, and I know this community inside and out. And let me remind you, Officer Evans, that I'm not just a teacher. I'm the superintendent of this district, and I will not tolerate being disrespected in this way, by you or anyone else." The teachers behind Brad exchanged uneasy glances, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. Brad, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, though the tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Superintendent or not, Mrs. Harris, you're not above the rules," Brad said, his voice cold. "And I'm here to make sure those rules are followed." Olivia took another step forward, her gaze unwavering. "I've followed the rules my entire career, Officer Evans. I've worked twice as hard, fought twice as hard, just to get to where I am today. I will not be bullied by you or anyone else into silence. I will continue to teach the truth, and if you have a problem with that, I suggest you take it up with the school board." For a moment, the hallway was silent. The teachers standing nearby were frozen in place, unsure of how to react to the confrontation unfolding before them. Brad stood his ground, his jaw tight, but Olivia could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to fight back. Not like this. "Is there a problem here?" A voice suddenly interrupted, and Olivia turned to see Mr. Thompson, the principal, walking down the hallway toward them. His face was a mixture of concern and confusion, clearly sensing the tension in the air. Brad was the first to speak. "Just having a discussion with Mrs. Harris," he said smoothly. "Making sure we're all on the same page when it comes to keeping this school running smoothly." Mr. Thompson's gaze shifted between the two of them, clearly trying to assess the situation. "Mrs. Harris? Is everything all right?" Olivia's eyes didn't leave Brad's for a moment. "I think Officer Evans and I have made our positions clear," she said quietly. "But I do have one question for you, Mr. Thompson." Mr. Thompson blinked. "Yes?" Olivia finally turned to face the principal, her voice calm but firm. "Are you going to stand by while I'm undermined in front of my colleagues and students? Or are you going to support the work I've been doing for this school district?" Mr. Thompson hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced at Brad, then back at Olivia, as if weighing his options. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. I think we all need to take a step back and remember that we're here for the students," Mr. Thompson said slowly. "We can't let personal disagreements get in the way of what's best for them." Olivia's heart sank. It wasn't the response she had hoped for. Mr. Thompson wasn't going to stand up for her, not in the way she needed him to. He was too concerned with keeping the peace, too worried about upsetting the balance of power. Brad, on the other hand, looked satisfied. He had won this round, and they both knew it. Without another word, Olivia turned and walked away, her heart heavy with frustration and anger. She had stood her ground, but it hadn't been enough. The system was stacked against her, and she knew it. But as she walked back to her classroom, Olivia made a silent promise to herself. She wasn't done fighting. Not yet. If Officer Evans thought he could silence her, he was wrong. This was only the beginning. The tension of the previous day still hung in the air as Olivia arrived at school the next morning. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the early morning mist clung to the trees lining the school's parking lot. She paused before stepping out of her car, staring at the imposing brick building in front of her. She had walked into Lakeside Middle countless times, but today, the weight of everything that had happened made the building seem different, almost unwelcoming. She took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She wasn't the type to run from a fight. Still, the encounter with Officer Evans and the lack of support from Mr. Thompson stung more than she cared to admit. In all her years of teaching and leading, she had never felt so disrespected in front of her colleagues. But it wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something bigger, something she couldn't walk away from. As Olivia entered the building, she felt the usual mix of nerves and determination. She had been in tight spots before, but this felt different. The eyes of the entire school were on her now, students and teachers alike, all waiting to see how she would respond. She knew she couldn't afford to let this situation get the better of her, for her students' sake and for her own. The hallway was quieter than usual as she made her way to her classroom. She could sense the unease, even from the few students who were already there, shuffling through the halls with their backpacks slung low. The whispers from yesterday's confrontation had spread like wildfire, and now, it seemed, everyone knew that something had happened between Mrs. Harris and Officer Evans. Olivia pushed open the door to her classroom and immediately set to work preparing for the day. The lesson plan for the week focused on the Reconstruction era, a topic that held deep significance for her. She knew the importance of teaching her students about the challenges and successes of Black Americans after the Civil War. But she also knew that this was exactly the type of subject that was making certain parents and Officer Evans uncomfortable. She wasn't going to back down. Not today. Not ever. As the students filed in, Olivia greeted them with her usual warm smile, though she could tell that many of them were distracted. Their conversations were hushed, their glances curious. Some of them were clearly still thinking about the events from the day before, and Olivia could see the questions in their eyes. When the final bell rang, she stood at the front of the class, her hands resting on the desk. For a moment, she didn't speak, letting the students settle into their seats and quiet down. She wanted their full attention before she began. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Before we get started with today's lesson, I want to address something that I'm sure some of you have been wondering about. A few of the students exchanged glances, clearly intrigued. "I know that some of you saw Officer Evans in our classroom yesterday," Olivia continued, her eyes scanning the room. "And I'm sure that many of you have heard rumors or whispers about what happened. I want to make sure you all understand something. What we're doing in this classroom, learning about history, about the past, about the struggles and triumphs of people who came before us, is important. It matters." She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. The students were silent now, their attention fully focused on her. "There are times when learning the truth makes people uncomfortable," Olivia said, her voice soft but firm. "But that doesn't mean we stop learning. We don't avoid difficult topics just because they challenge us. We face them head on, and we learn from them. That's how we grow." One student, a boy named Javier, raised his hand. "Are you in trouble, Mrs. Harris?" Olivia smiled gently. "No, Javier, I'm not in trouble. I'm here to teach you, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." There was a sense of relief in the room, though the undercurrent of tension remained. Olivia knew that her students trusted her, but they were also aware of the larger forces at play. They were old enough to sense when something wasn't right, and she wasn't going to insult their intelligence by pretending otherwise. The lesson began smoothly, and Olivia guided the students through the intricacies of the Reconstruction era with the same passion she had always brought to her teaching. She spoke of the struggles that African Americans faced in the years following the Civil War, the policies that were meant to rebuild the South, but often left Black communities vulnerable. She didn't shy away from the difficult truths, but she balanced the darkness with stories of resilience, hope, and progress. As she spoke, Olivia could feel her students engaging with the material. They asked thoughtful questions, participated in discussions, and seemed genuinely interested in the subject matter. For a moment, it felt like everything had returned to normal. But just as she was wrapping up the lesson, the door to the classroom swung open. Officer Evans stood in the doorway, his expression hard and unreadable. The room went silent, every pair of eyes shifting between Olivia and the officer. Olivia's heart skipped a beat, but she maintained her composure, standing tall at the front of the room. "Mrs. Harris," Brad said, his voice cold. "I need a word." Olivia's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Can this wait, Officer Evans? I'm in the middle of a lesson." "No," he replied, his tone firm. "It can't." The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly sensing the tension between the two adults. Olivia could feel their eyes on her, their confusion and concern palpable. She took a deep breath, then nodded. "All right," she said, her voice steady. She turned to the class. "Please take out your textbooks and begin reading the next section. I'll be right back." As she stepped into the hallway, Olivia's mind raced. She knew that whatever was about to happen wasn't going to be pleasant, but she had no choice but to face it head on. Once the door closed behind them, Officer Evans wasted no time. "I told you to tone it down, Mrs. Harris," he said, his voice low and full of restrained anger. "I told you this isn't the place for stirring things up." Olivia's eyes narrowed. "I'm teaching history, Officer Evans. That's my job. If you have a problem with the curriculum, take it up with the school board." Brad took a step closer, his posture menacing. "You think you can just walk in here and do whatever you want? This is my school, and I won't let you turn it into a battleground for your politics." Olivia's patience snapped. "Your school? I don't think so, Officer Evans. This is a place of learning, and as the superintendent, it is my responsibility to ensure that the students here get a proper education, one that includes the truth." Brad's expression darkened, but before he could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Is there a problem here?" Olivia and Brad both turned to see Mr. Thompson, the principal, walking toward them. His expression was tight, clearly sensing the confrontation brewing between them. "I was just making sure Mrs. Harris understands her role," Brad said, his tone suddenly smooth, though Olivia could hear the underlying threat in his words. Mr. Thompson looked between the two of them, clearly uncomfortable. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I think we all need to remember that we're here for the students. Let's not let personal differences get in the way of that." Olivia felt a wave of frustration wash over her. Once again, Mr. Thompson was trying to play both sides, unwilling to take a firm stand. But before she could say anything, Brad spoke again. "I agree, Principal Thompson," he said smoothly. "But I think it's important that we all stay on the same page when it comes to maintaining order in the school." Olivia's eyes flashed with anger. "Order? What you mean is maintaining control, Officer Evans. But I'm not going to let you dictate what I teach in my classroom." Mr. Thompson held up his hands, trying to defuse the situation. "All right, let's all take a step back. We don't need to escalate this further." Olivia felt her pulse quicken. She had had enough of this. Enough of being told to back down, enough of being undermined, enough of Officer Evans' veiled threats. She took a deep breath and looked Mr. Thompson square in the eye. "If you're not going to support me, Principal Thompson, then I'll take this to the school board myself," Olivia said, her voice calm but full of conviction. "I'm not going to compromise on the truth. Not for anyone." Mr. Thompson's expression faltered, and for a moment he looked as though he wasn't sure how to respond. Brad, on the other hand, glared at her, his jaw tight with barely suppressed anger. But Olivia didn't care anymore. She wasn't going to be bullied into silence. She had worked too hard and come too far to let people like Officer Evans intimidate her. Without waiting for a response, Olivia turned and walked back into her classroom, her heart pounding in her chest. The students looked up at her as she entered, their eyes full of questions. Olivia smiled at them, though her mind was still buzzing with everything that had just happened. She had a long road ahead of her, but one thing was clear: she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. And so the battle lines were drawn. Olivia knew that this was only the beginning of a larger fight, one that would test her resolve, her strength, and her commitment to the truth. But she was ready. No matter what came next, she would stand her ground. Did you enjoy this story? Don't stop now. Click on the video to watch the next one. Thanks for your support, and please share your feedback with us.